I'm Ann Siegel. I'm the Director of Advocacy, Education, and Outreach at Disability Rights Florida. Disability Rights Florida is your state's protection and advocacy agency. We are federally funded under 8 different grants. We're a not-for-profit. Our main offices are in Tallahassee, and then we have 2 other offices in Tampa and Hollywood, and some satellite sprinkling throughout. We cover the entire state from Key West to the Panhandle, and we are free, legal, and confidential advocacy services. It's our mission statement, and I like to take questions as we're going so the information is relevant to what you want to hear and not me just sitting up here thinking what you want to hear. I don't know everybody's preference, but I prefer to have it interactive. So if you have questions, feel free. I had somebody in the previous session earlier tell me that they were being argumentative, and I said, bring it on. I'm ready for argument, so let's go. I'm not afraid of that. I won't shy away. So feel free to ask any questions that are coming up. Let's see. Okay. So this is kind of an overview of what we're covering, and don't hold me to it. I'm not sure it's actually in that order because I did kind of move things around while I was making my final prep last night, and I think some things might be out of order. So, but hopefully this is what we're going to cover, but I can't guarantee we're covering it in that order. Okay, so schools are obviously responsible for keeping all students safe, and there's a kind of juggling, balancing act on keeping students who are behaviorally challenged in the classroom learning and making sure that all the students are learning and that the behaviors are not impeding the student experiencing the behaviors and the rest of the classroom. So that's why I think these kind of situations are very challenging, because we're trying to make sure everybody's learning and that everybody's rights are protected. So it's kind of difficult at times for the schools to not focus just on the behavior, and sometimes we'll get into situations where we're not looking at really the function of the behavior, we're just looking at the end result, and it can be a little bit of a problem. So administration has to obviously keep the peace in the school, and as discussed in one of my earlier sessions today, there was somebody who made a comment about how do we please everyone, and I'm going to say right now you can't. You just can't please everyone. The best thing to do is to try to work with everyone to come up with a compromise, but there's no way. There are certain rights that are afforded under federal law, and sometimes other parents won't understand that, or sometimes school members don't understand that. So it's really difficult, and I know one of the suggestions, well, what if we come up with a form that says, there's procedural safeguards written into the law, and I think we just need to respect those, but I think keeping an open mind and collaborating and not getting into I need to keep things fair. I once saw a presentation where somebody said, fair is where cows and pigs win blue ribbons. That's about it. What the federal law is made to do is to level the playing field. So what some people will say is not fair, it's not an unfair advantage, it's actually considered a reasonable accommodation. And if we're going to talk about fairness, is it really fair to be punished for a manifestation of your disability? And when I usually put it into the example, if I were a student who were blind and could not see the board, would you punish me for not being able to read off the board? And I think common sense kind of dictates, no, we would not punish me for that behavior. It's the same thing with students who have behavioral challenges that are part of their disability. So these are the legal authorities that kind of what guide us. We've got the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and there is an acronym cheat sheet in your packet. because if you're doing special education, you know everything's based on acronyms. We have our own language. So that's referred to as IDEA. And then the final regulations are the Code of Federal Regulations with the CFR, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. If you saw the opening yesterday, you saw a lot more information on that. Florida statutes, state board education rules, district school board policies, special programs and procedures. And what I can tell you is school board policies, code of conduct, all of that must conform with federal law, because you can't make a policy that supersedes federal law. And I was kind of telling everybody to head on over to the DOE booth in the conference section, because they have what we call the Red Book, and it's the book that deals with the State Board of Education rules and statutes. I've been told they've run out, but if you go there, you can order it, or you can call in or go on their website. It's really a great book to have, because it helps you understand what the regulations and the statutes are. So I highly recommend that you all have that. So we all know and deal with students who've been suspended. Ironically, this morning on the news, I believe it was Flagler County announced that they were looking at policies in reducing suspension for their students. So I was like, what county is that? What county? I had to watch the crawl like 5 or 6 times to catch it, and ironically, each time I would look away, they would show it, but it is Flagler County. And the Student Code of Conduct, yes, the Student Code of Conduct must conform with federal and state law. And that's something sometimes that I look at it and I see that there's a discrepancy. So I know every year when our district would send out the Student Code of Conduct, and parents are supposed to sign it, they've read the copy and understand it, I would always write, and it must conform with federal IDEA and 504. So I think my school district kind of was used to seeing that every year.
So state law has to,
Federal law supersedes state.
So they can have additional regulations?
They can always do more,
okay,
but they can't do less.
Okay.
So they can't take away any of the rights that are granted by federal law.
Okay.
So, okay, and that's kind of sometimes
Yeah.
the challenge that we have in advocacy. So, suspension laws. I'm not a proponent of suspension. I don't think if anyone who knows me, they're not going to be surprised by that. I think what it does is sometimes sends the wrong message. If you're having a student who's acting out because of task avoidance behavior, you have just given them like the lotto winnings. Now I don't have to be there. Yay. So I think it actually can sometimes work against and reinforce the bad behavior or the inappropriate behavior. And so that's why I got to tell you right now, I'm really not a fan of it. And sometimes we get into this whole conundrum of, well, then what do we do when a student has, violated the code of conduct? So students need to learn appropriate ways to behave and to cope. And I'm not a proponent, much to what you might hear about me, of letting kids run amok or letting kids act out, because I understand that what we need to do is make sure we extinguish the inappropriate behavior and replace it with a more appropriate behavior. What I've learned from listening to those who deal in the behavior business is if we don't come up with an appropriate replacement behavior, the student will choose it themselves, and it might be worse than the one we started out with. So it needs to be obviously a behavior that's appropriate, that the student's going to buy into, but we need to have a plan, and we're going to get into that more. But like I said, when you send a student home, they lose that opportunity to learn that skill in the place that they need it most, and that's in the school moving forward and learning, because each time the student is suspended, they're going to lose out on that beneficial educational time. Okay, so what do we know? Well, I have yet to find any research that supports suspension as an effective method to teach replacement behavior. I've had some people tell me we don't need research. But I think research is what's supposed to drive all of our educational decisions. I've constantly heard everything needs to be research-based and data-driven. So that's another thing I use that I don't understand. And the constant discipline does not reduce the recidivism of the behavior. So we need to find something that's going to work. So, rule of thumb, we kind of have this thing in our office that says the number of days of suspension a student with a disability can be suspended without rising to the level of being considered a denial of a free and appropriate public education is 10. So, also known as the 10 FAPE-free days. Yes. Or, no, consecutive and cumulative.
Why is it 10 for kids of any grade? For example, 10 for high schooler may be more appropriate than 10 for somebody in pre-K.
Because that's what the federal law says. Somebody picked 10 as the magic number, and so we stick with 10. It's on the 11th day.
Okay.
And we'll get into a little more of that. So expulsion. I kind of have always said you can't expel a student with a disability because in my mind there's a little glitch in that plan. You can technically expel a student, but they cannot be removed from FAPE. So while you can call it an expulsion, the student still has to be receiving a free and appropriate public education. So it can be a removal from that setting, but it can't be a total denial, an expulsion, because the student needs to continue receiving FAPE. And that, I have to tell you, I'm surprised all these years of advocacy, I'm still finding that certain districts are having trouble wrapping their mind around that issue. So, when the school district's considering suspension that's going to go over 10 days, and I know you said consecutive, and I said no, consecutive and cumulative, because there's a little caveat in there. If we're doing suspensions for the same sort of issue, and we're removing that student, it can be considered a change of placement, and so that's where those 10 days come in. So there is a certain level of due process that must be afforded. Now there's the exception to every rule, and that's when a student is going to, I jumped ahead. The school may make a unilateral change in placement for 10 school days or less if the student violates a code of conduct, and we're going back into that whole issue of 10 FAPE-free days. And if the student is, if it's considered not a manifestation of the student's discipline, not a manifestation of the student's disability, then the student can be disciplined the same as his non-disabled peers, but he cannot again be denied FAPE. And here's the thing, the IEP team is the one who determines placement. And I'm going to tell you, in all the years of advocating, I cannot tell you how many times administration has decided the placement and how many times I've had to, go back and forth with school board attorneys on that is not what the law says. It says the IEP team determines placement.
So if it is a manifestation of the disability,
then the student stays, and I'll get into a little more of that. So let me just get into special circumstances and we'll get to that, but that's a good question. So the special circumstances, okay? The student carries or possesses a weapon. A student brings a gun in, we have an issue, and these are the exceptions. They can go to an interim alternative education setting. Student knowingly possesses illegal drugs or sells them at a school or a school function, or the student has inflicted serious bodily injury. Now, serious bodily injury is serious bodily injury. It is not, and I have to tell you, I've read the case law, and this upset a district recently because they were like, well, these two kids in the playground got into a little altercation, and one of the little kids got hurt, but the student did not need to seek medical, and the little guy just went right back out on the playground to play. That's not serious bodily injury according to the case law. And I'm telling you, it is serious bodily injury. We're talking about serious disfigurement, extreme. It's not grabbing somebody's shirt. It's not even a kid grabbing another kid by the neck, unless, of course, the kid ends up in the hospital. It is, and this is a really misunderstood, definition.
I'm from St. Lucie County, and one of our circumstances this year stated that a child, he basically threw a desk, didn't harm or seriously injure anybody, but they consider this a special circumstance because he destroyed property.
Property is not covered in that. That's the same thing, which I do a quickie on restraint and seclusion.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing. The destruction of property is what insurance is for.
So they
No,
cannot.
they cannot. But like I said, I could probably go into early retirement if I had a dime for every time we got a phone call with this issue. And, if there's 2 lawyers in a room, there's going to be 3 opinions. So it's serious bodily injury is serious bodily injury. And it's not, now if he threw the desk and hit somebody and they got a concussion, you'd have serious bodily injury. But just merely throwing the desk and hurting property is not. Okay, services during placement. That's determined by the IEP team, whether it is or is not a manifestation of the student's disability. It is not an administrative issue. So let's just say we're moving along and Johnny's done a violation of code of conduct and it is a manifestation of his disability. He asked, what happens? The student remains in the same setting unless the parent and the LEA, which is a local education agency, agree to move the student to another placement. Because sometimes, and I've had the case where the parent has been asking for a therapeutic placement, and the school is saying, we don't have data to support that therapeutic change. And then Johnny comes in, does something, and now everyone's, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? And the parent's sort of like, I told you so. But anyway, we get into this issue, where's Johnny needs, our needs are gonna be met. So we review the IEP, we look at present levels, we look at goals and objectives, we look at related services, and we determine that this IEP could best be met in a different setting. So then they agree to move him. But if the parent says no, then Johnny stays there, and if the school district does not agree, they have to take Johnny's family to hearing. But
Can you give me an example in a regular inclusion high school setting? What a different setting might be if a parent and the LEA agree?
well, it depends on the continuum of services. Every school district must have a continuum of services. So let's just say the case scenario that I told you, where the parent wanted a therapeutic setting, that student would have been moved to a therapeutic classroom. And in every county, it looks different, because I have to tell you, there needs to be continuum. We start out in gen ed, we bring in supports. We don't just right away, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So will bringing in supplementary aids and services make that placement appropriate? Do we need to look? One of the things I keep telling schools is moving from gen ed to a segregated classroom is not the magic fix, because you're going to deal with a whole other host of behavioral issues when you have a classroom full of students who are behaviorally challenged, because I've seen the interplay with them setting each other off. So that's really not the magic fix, and I know everyone tells me, oh, but it's more structured and the teachers are trained better. And well, I say then train the teachers in the other classroom, and nobody should not be trained. So but the IEP team determines that even if it's not a manifestation of Johnny's disability, the IEP team still decides where he goes.
When you say manifestation of his disability, do we need to have a disability determination prior to that? I mean, you should have, obviously you're gonna have an IEP,
Mm-hmm.
so you have a disability, but the behavior that the child is exhibiting, how do you determine that it's a manifestation of that disability that's determined on the IEP? Sometimes it's
jumped ahead. That's actually in here, and I used the
It is?
exact term.
Okay, well,
Yes.
good.
So we'll get to that. I'm saying you're jumping ahead, but I'm going to go to the. Well, I'll try to get back on track here. It's the 10-day rule when those due process rights kick in, and students with disabilities are treated the same way. And then prior to that 11th day, so we have this little comment in our office. I said, I'm going to get one of those little cross-stitch things that say on the 11th day, God created a manifestation determination. Because I say it so often that the other people in my office joke and go, oh, well, here you go again. They're used to these buzzwords that I'm constantly saying. So when the student with a disability, we have a manifestation determination meeting. And it's kind of usually what it looks like, or more people if I show up. So get there, and here are the questions. The determination that there exists a substantial relationship between the student's disability and the specific behavior. Next question. And a manifestation determination must be made at any time they're considering a change of placement. Let me kind of get to the subject that we were looking at. It's not required. I do get some phone calls, so I wanted to put there in there. If your child's been suspended 3 days, no manifestation determination. Now, if it's the 13th day and it's 10 plus 3, yeah, you're correct, but not until the 11th day. So this is just a little case that says if the manifestation reveals that the student's conduct was a manifestation of his disability, the student cannot be expelled or suspended from the conduct beyond the 10-day, and there's an OSEP letter in there. And you can Google that and you'll find that information. So we're going to go through to get to your question. Let's develop a student profile, look at the other interventions. It's much more than just an eligibility. And that's kind of the thing that I found people have trouble wrapping their heads around, because we look at it like, oh, student X is got a specific learning disability. There's no yes, there is. There's frustration in having a learning disability. There are behaviors that are part of that. And there are also students with disabilities that are not delineated under IDEA, so they may be a student with a learning disability, but they may also have a mental illness in there or some other, and we've just looked at, okay, this student, and this is what their, quote, eligibility is. We don't go by eligibility. We go under how that student's disability manifests and how it affects that student's ability to gain educational benefit. And that's why when you're writing your present levels of performance, it's vitally important for you to put in the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because I know sometimes parents say, ooh, I don't want to write all that ugly stuff.
So
Nobody's going to want it.
it.
It needs to be in there. If you don't have it in your present level, you're not going to get it in your goals and objectives. You're not going to get it in your related services. It has to be there. Especially if you've got Willy Wonka's golden ticket. If you know what sets Johnny off, or you know what works really well to not set Johnny off, that stuff needs to be in the plan, because we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. So yeah, definitely. It needs to be there. And sometimes I have, I don't want to put it in there. No one will want this. They have to take your student. We have to work with our students as they come, and everybody's unique. So.
Yeah, but sometimes they don't know that.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you. Yeah, and we have another little issue that's been rearing its little ugly head around the state lately, is there's a Florida statute that says that the teacher has a right to remove a student, and there's a whole process to that. But I'm finding in some of the cases that we're getting, because of course, again, no one calls me when things work. They only call when it's a problem, right? So they're not following that process. And they're just like glomming on to that. I have a right to refuse the school. Well, it's okay if there's multiple options for classrooms, but if you're in a smaller district when it's this one class and this one teacher says, I'm not gonna do that's a big problem. And we're finding the behavior soup du jour is this issue right now with teachers invoking that. And we've had to go back and remind the school district that there is a process, and that sometimes in some of the cases we have that process has not been followed, so that teacher couldn't invoke that. But now we have the problem, you fight to keep Johnny in the classroom with a teacher who doesn't want him. But if that's the only classroom, we're kind of stuck in a situation.
But again, if you have it written in your IEP, you don't
Yes.
have that issue.
Yeah, and you shouldn't. So, here are the 2 questions under IDEA that you need to look at when you're doing your manifestation determination. If the conduct in question was caused by or had a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability, or if the conduct in question is a direct result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP. It used to say that the IEP wasn't appropriate, and then they changed it because I guess we couldn't get anyone to agree that the IEP was never appropriate. So was it a failure? And oftentimes we find that there are behavioral goals that are on there, or supports and services that are on there that no one was aware of and we're not implementing, and that's it. So it's one or the other. It doesn't have to be both. I'll get to your question in a second. And one of the things I found in some of the districts, they have like this whole laundry list of questions. And I drive them nuts because they start going, was the child remorseful? Did the child know what they were doing? Did the child say they were sorry? And I'm like, not relevant. This is not relevant. I said, I understand you all have a process and a procedure, but these are the only 2 questions under federal law that matter.
Now, as far as the failure to implement the IEP, that goes with if there's a behavioral intervention plan, right? The
Behavioral intervention plan should be,
followed?
yeah, it should be referenced in the IEP.
Okay.
They shouldn't be 2 living documents. And there's a split in the administrative hearings that I've seen where they consider them the same, and then another judge said, no, they're 2 separate documents. They're right, they're 2 separate documents. But if
They both reference.
they both are supposed to be referenced, you're supposed to have like goal behavior. There's like a question, does behavior impede learning? Well, if it does, there should be goals and objectives. And if it rises to the level substantially, that student should have a behavior intervention plan. And it should be made for that student, which I'm going to get into behavior intervention plans. But my thing is, when we have a district-wide behavior intervention plan, that's like, think about clothing. Does one size really fit all? Because I know that I've seen some very, very tiny ladies walking around out there, and I cannot wear their clothes. So neither does the idea of one size fits all. School-based behavior plans that may work for the average student that has a little, but if you have a kid where it rises to the level of impeding their education, then we should have a positive behavior intervention plan. And again, the IEP team determines whether it's a manifestation of the student's disability. Sometimes I find administration that says, oh no, I looked at it, no, it's not. So we really need to have the people who are specially trained, who have knowledge of the student going in there. So that question, was the resulting behavior significantly related to the student's disability, not label? So that's exactly what we mean, not eligibility. Was it adequately addressed? We had one school district that actually said to us, it's not failure to implement the IEP, we didn't have behavior in there at all. And I'm like, oh, that's not a good defense, because you should have been addressing behavior, because there were a number of referrals for the same behavior. And that's also data that you should be looking for. Is Johnny constantly getting written up? I had somebody in a previous session come to me and say a student in a county they reside in is getting written up for stimming behavior and getting referrals. And I'm like, that's an issue you should not be getting written up for. So a student should not receive consequences if it's a manifestation of his or her disability. It doesn't mean we shouldn't address it in goals and objectives. We shouldn't look at collecting data and doing an FBA and a BIP, but you shouldn't get punished for something that was beyond your control. So if it's not a manifestation, I said they can be disciplined, but they must continue to receive FAPE. If it is a manifestation of the student's disability, no punishment. But both students need to receive their services and keep moving towards the state standards. Sorry, we don't call them Sunshine State standards anymore. So each decision is a team decision. What to do if you disagree? If the parent disagrees with a decision or action, the parent has a right to file and request an expedited due process hearing. The hearing must be held within 20 school days and a resolution session within 7 days of the LEA receiving the notice of due process. So, functional behavioral assessment or analysis, it depends on who you talk to. They use the words interchangeably, and a positive behavior intervention. So when we're doing the functional behavior assessment, we're going to be looking at the function of the behavior. Another issue I have is when somebody tells me there was absolutely no antecedent to my Johnny's behavior. There is. We might not have seen it. We might not have been able to catch it, but there is always an antecedent before the behavior. It's not all task avoidance or willful and wrongful disrespect. It's sometimes maybe something that you didn't pick up. It could be the student's frustrated. It could be somebody set the student off and nobody noticed. I mean, there's 20 other students in the classroom or 25 other students in the classroom. I don't expect everyone to have eyes on Johnny 24/7. So we need to have a positive behavior intervention plan, and we need to be proactive, not reactive. And I find a lot more that we're more reactive. We wait until it's at an epic proportion before we address the behavior. So best practices, whenever the behavior appears to be significantly interfering, that's when we need the FBA. That's me after a meeting, so be proactive, not reactive. So why should we do an FBA? Because, again, the behaviors are impeding the student's ability to gain educational benefit, and it could also be affecting the classmates in the room. We don't want everyone losing educational time, and we need to do that FBA. So you'll see a pattern. We had one situation where the young man acted out every day after lunch, and I'm sitting in the meeting and we're having this conversation, and I said, has anyone taken any data on when it occurs? No, of course not. So we start looking at all the referrals, and the first thing we notice, ding, 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 it's always with the same teacher. So then, we're like, is it a personality conflict between the student and the teacher? Well, that was part of the reason, but there was also 2 other factors. One, it was right after lunch, so I just been able to get all unstructured and have a good time with my peers, and my medication is now waning towards the end of the day. So, the student was going into their least successful academic class right after lunch. So when we actually sat down and looked at it, and I was like, let's put it all together. But nobody had looked at it prior, and that's what what boggles my mind is like, it's the same teacher, and right away the teacher says he disrespects me. So she felt personally, attacked. And I said, well, if you look at it, we've got all these other factors. We moved the student out of that reading class had to have reading earlier in the day because it was a less preferred activity and the student struggled with it. And then the parent went back and talked to the doctor about the whole medication issue wearing off. And I'm not proposing that students all need to be on medication. I'm just saying in this student's particular situation, that was it. So, let's keep moving. So, when we look at functional behavior assessments, we need to do observations and data collection. And this is where I find a challenge because it's a people power challenge. Who do we have that can do this? You've got a teacher who's teaching a classroom of 20 plus students. I don't have time to do it. We're going to bring a parent in. I don't have training to do it. It needs to be somebody who can understand to take the data and have trained and look at what the function or purpose is. And sometimes I have students who are nonverbal, and that is their method of communication. And we get in there, and the first thing I say is, the student has no meaningful method of communication but to act out. Seriously, we all need me to come in and say this? So, this is what, wiser minds than mine can figure out without me being there. So we look at it, predict the occurrences in Johnny's situation. When was it happening? It was happening right after lunch. Why was it happening after lunch? He was going into reading. This was a quick fix for them. We didn't have to go into this whole positive behavior intervention plan, but in some cases you will need to. So parents, you should be part of this process. You need to give important information in there. Interview with the student, family, teachers, and people who are familiar. Review of records and formal and informal measurements. Okay. So I really find a problem when the parent's not brought into this whole process, because you know your child across all settings. They know them in the school setting, but you see them in the community, you see them in the home. So that information needs to be included. So we're going to identify and describe the target behavior. We're going to look at the data analysis. Let's look at the strengths of the student, reinforcement, and then we're going to do a hypothesis development. Another pet peeve of mine is when we decide that Johnny just chooses to misbehave. Based on what? Well, he just chooses to misbehave. So my theory is, if my hypothesis is incorrect, how valid is the rest of my plan? We need to really get somebody in there who can do that number crunching. We can look at the psychological evaluation reports, social development history, IEP. Some districts call it eligibility staffing forms that do the eligibility, and the very important, nothing should be decided without data. So we're moving into the positive behavior intervention plan. Now you'll notice that it's referenced as a BIP in the law, behavior intervention plan, but it's supposed to be positive behavior intervention plan, so we just call it a PBIP because we want to have another acronym. So the key term is positive. What's reinforcing to the student? Goes back to the age grade thing. So my youngest daughter laughs when I do this example because she doesn't agree with me on this one. Stickers may be reinforcing to the second grader. They may love to have stickers. But the high school student, not so much. Kind of don't want you giving me stickers in front of my peers. Thank you much. I'm going to get beat up after school. Thanks a lot. So, although my daughter says, but I still love stickers and I'm in high school. And I'm like, well, you're the exception. So we need to have something that's going to be reinforcing to the student. One of my high schoolers, it was particularly to have a certain snack or one of those energy drinks. And so it's got to be something the student will buy into working for, because if we're going to give stickers to an 11th grade Johnny in high school, I really don't think that's going to be motivating. Some students, it's more time on the computer. Another student, it was headphones when they were doing their independent classwork. He would get to wear headphones and listen to music. So it needs to be on what's reinforcing for the student. And I don't want to hear it's not fair to let Johnny wear headphones, because remember, fair, it's cows and pigs. So the replacement behavior must be realistic. I don't want to see goals that say Johnny will act appropriately. What does that mean? Because what may be appropriate for me may not be appropriate for you. What if I'm one of those people who are very, very, very intensely high-strung, and I think that people shouldn't smile, and people are smiling in my classroom. So we've got to make sure that we define these very vague terms and that they're measurable. So I don't want to see goals that say appropriate. What is appropriate? What are you expecting? If we're having a student who's calling out constantly, that we're going to decrease the level of calling out. And then we're going to develop a plan to give that student a longer wait period time so they increase their ability. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're looking for is our students to be successful as adults. And what's cute when you're 2 is not cute when you're 21. So let's start to look at changing those behaviors and teaching those coping strategies and having something that will be successful post-secondary, and at the end goal is to get a job and be employable, unless you win lotto, and then you're lucky because you don't have to work. But I don't know many places, and I often see plans that say things like, okay, here's a big one. Johnny drops the F-bomb everywhere, and so we suspend him a lot because we can't have kids dropping the F-bomb. Well, then I look at the IEP and I look under the employment domain and it says no goals in this area. I don't know any place you can work at that's going to let you drop F-bombs. So that does impact employability. So there should be goals in there, and it would go into the, Johnny's going to drop the F-bomb less and less and less, and we're going to do, he's dropping it 15 times a day, and we're going to reduce it and reduce it and reduce it, and we're not going to keep throwing him out of school because we're not going to teach him the socially appropriate behavior. Although that's a really hard one because I know everyone gets really, really, really upset over the whole F-bomb issue. But the staff needs to be trained on it. Everybody who comes into contact with your child should know how to deal with the positive behavior intervention. And it should be across all settings. This should be the plan you're using at home. If you have a child who has a behavior plan at home, try to mesh and incorporate so we're not all over the place and we keep it consistent. And then there are rewards. Sometimes the rewards can't be during the school. They need to be after hours. He earns more computer time, or he gets to play more video games, or he gets to go to the movies. But, you know, like I said, work together and come up with something across. So I kind of seem to be the theme of it's inappropriate to utilize some other responses such as suspension if the student's IEP or positive behavior plan have that targeted behavior. I can't tell you how many times we go in and we see that Johnny will decrease his out of seat time and work toward whatever. And then I say, why was he suspended? Well, he was out of his seat. Well, isn't that part of the goal in the behavior intervention plan? Why are we still punishing over that behavior? If obviously the BIP's not working, we need to tweak it and figure it out. Just like the IEP, they're living, breathing documents. But let's not keep suspending the student over the same behavior. That, I believe, is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So, let's not see that. Here's the thing. There's nothing in the law that mandates who can do behavior intervention plans. There's no requirement for a BCBA or a CBA. So oftentimes when we ask for somebody trained, we get told, hey, there's nothing that says it has to be at this level. Well, that's a problem because you wouldn't want the media specialist doing a behavior intervention plan, and we wouldn't want the person who cooks the food in the cafeteria doing a behavior intervention plan. That person needs to be trained in that area of knowledge, and oftentimes we have paraprofessionals keeping data, and there are these tally marks, and they tell me nothing because I don't know what setting they happened in, I don't know what happened before, I just know they happened a lot. So it really needs to be somebody who's going to be trained in it and know what they're doing. So if I have an FBA and I don't feel that it's valid, I'm going to ask the school district for an independent education evaluation of public expense. They can either grant my request or they can take us to hearing to defend their FBA. But an FBA is just like any other evaluation. While it doesn't give you an eligibility, it is still an evaluation. So you can ask for an independent if by any chance, and I know I'm using like these ridiculous kind of things, if your cafeteria person is doing your FBA, then Houston, you have a problem. And it may not be valid unless, of course, in another life there were this great behavior person and they understand it. So they need to have an ability to develop and implement a plan, knowledge and skills, and effective interventions. There does need to be qualifications. And oftentimes when I get told things like, we can't mandate training, there's a teachers union. Well, collective bargaining agreements do not override the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So what I'll tell parents you need to make sure is in your child's IEP is that all adults who come in contact with Johnny will be trained in, his disability, trained in his IEP, trained on his BIP, so that everybody working with him has a certain qualification. And then like any other place and any other job, if you're not qualified for the position, you don't get it. It's just the way it is. I can't add, you don't want to see my checkbook. Nobody's going to hire me to be their bookkeeper. I'm not qualified to do it, and it's the same issue. but make sure that if there are certain qualifications needed, that those are in your child's IEP. And most districts have a spot that talks about training for school personnel. So that's the place where those things should be delineated. And like I said, if you get somebody who's not qualified for training on an FBA or doing a BEP, or you get the one size fits all, you can ask for those IEEs. So some Q&A. When are manifestation determinations required?
11.
Yay, on the 11th day. Who participates in the determination? Yeah. What data should or should not be considered? All data. Would a student with a disability described by this profile, placed in this set of circumstances, be expected to act in this manner? Usually, yeah. Usually it's really not a surprise. And oftentimes we'll go and ask for complete records requests, and I will sit there and look at elementary, and this could be a high schooler, and I'm seeing the pattern. And I'm like, wow, we're lucky it didn't explode earlier. But I'm surprised the kid was able to keep it together. Once you do those and you sit down and you look at all the different, you're gonna see that this was not rocket science. This was, an accident waiting to happen. But if there's numerous changes in classes and schools and counties, some of that information gets lost in the shuffle. But usually we'll come in and ask for all the records, and we'll look at them, and I'll just look at the psychological reports and go, it was here. Why didn't we address it? Why wasn't it addressed before it went to epic proportions?
I have a question.
Sure.
In the county that I reside,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes I've been told the behavior analyst is not allowed to go into the school that the child is in the classroom. Is there anything that we can?
The behavioral analyst is not, why would the analyst?
Well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. Does that seem appropriate?
No, because
Okay.
why would, I'm the behavior analyst. I am the person who's the end all be all.
The analyst is saying that they're not allowed into the classroom.
Okay, then that goes to based on what rule, regulation, statute, and authority. Please give me the policy, because I want to see what it is,
Okay.
and
so
that's
you
the
can ask for
question.
the policy.
Absolutely. If any time you're advocating for your child and somebody tells you, you can't do that because of X,
Yeah.
my team is all trained to say, can I see X? Because it needs to be in writing.
Right.
It can't be arbitrary and capricious. We have to have, and it has to be the same rules apply to you that apply to you, because we don't ever want it to look like it's retaliatory, because maybe mom, you're a little more zealous in your advocacy, and I can't get you out of my office, so I'm just gonna kind of dial it up a little on you. And you're just so pleasant to deal with, so whenever you want, it's okay.
My son actually has a counselor who goes into the school and goes into the classroom and works with the teacher. She's present at the IEP meetings. She's been involved in the VIP, and she goes every week.
Well, and outside providers after 1108, Senate Bill 1108 that happened several years ago, says the outside providers can come into the classroom and do that. There's different,
Ask for the policy.
yeah, you know what, that's with anything. It's like
Right.
anywhere I go,
Right.
every time I'm told no, it can't be done, because I'm always like, there's an exception to every rule. Come on, where's that exception? I want to see it. So, how do I effectively advocate? Keep records of your student. Keep files, binders, however best works for you. I kept files, because I'm a lawyer. I had every evaluation, every assessment, every IEP. Take note of everything that's reported. Oftentimes, we had one case where the student had difficulty sitting with the evaluator in a one-to-one session, and the kid was like Tasmanian. little devil. He was all around the room. He was throwing blocks. He was doing all this. And we're talking about a one-to-one session with an evaluator. And I'm like, and we're saying that there is no impact behaviorally? And that was in a one-to-one small room with all these preferred toys, and my kid was everywhere in this. I'm like, come on, So make sure it's all documented. Present level of performance. I should be able to pick up every one of your child's present level of performance in an IEP and know exactly what I need to advocate for, because you've written them so specifically that if you move from county to county, we can just pick up without it and hit the ground running. So they really do need to be very specific. That also goes for your related services. I need to know time, duration, place, everything on the IEP should be very specific so that because oftentimes things change and you'll have to move county to county. And a lot of the counties don't even use the same form. You go to different districts, some use the state, I think it's PEER, and it's the IEP that DOE has. And then other counties use their own IEP form. So, you've got to know all that, but everything should be very specific. You got to note the poor impulse control, problem with authority figures. I represent quite a few kids who have problems with authority figures and have a very deep sense of right and wrong. And so the harm may not have happened to them, but they think it's an injustice to the kid next to them, and they can't let it go. And they keep getting in trouble for that same behavior. We have to address that. I think it's great. Yeah, you should be a lawyer when you grow up. But right now we've got to find a way to kind of channel that into positive energy, because you keep getting suspended. And I actually represented 2 young men who had that. So the student's more than the label. What is it? And oftentimes, we'll get a call for a service request, and I'll look at it, and it'll have like 17 different disabilities, and I'll pick up the IEP, and it says other health impaired, and then I read the present level of performance, and none of that is reflected. While they may give you one eligibility, all of how that manifests needs to be in that present level of performance. So make sure when you're sharing information, there's also such thing as sharing too much information. Give what's needed to education plan. Your child does have a right to privacy and confidentiality. Don't ever let them talk to private therapists and doctors unfettered. That should all be, through you parents. We'll set up a meeting. You can talk to Johnny's doctor at 4 o'clock. We'll do a 3-way phone call. But I just don't agree with giving everyone carte blanche to everything that's ever happened, because I've seen how that can go wrong. I've seen people who thought it would be great to share all this information, and then in turn it has blown up because now there are warning flags and things that would never even, things that happened 10 years ago are coming back to haunt the students. So be very careful what you share, but make sure you do this. Behavior intervention plans are living, breathing documents. If it's not working, readdress it. Note that I've been told by behaviorists that it's usually going to get worse before it gets better. So when you're starting to try to rein in that behavior, it may go a little off the charts. Usually, the schools will say, I told you it wasn't going to work, and it's like, no, we've got to do this effectively and consistently. Think about how long it's going to take. And I think somebody said once in a training I went to that it takes probably 6 months or more to change and shape that behavior. This is the way I'm used to dealing with you. And now you've changed the way you're dealing with me to help me correct my behavior, but I'm still in the mode of this is how I deal with you. So it's not just going to magically get better overnight. We need to really give some time and go back in and tweak it. It takes a lot. I've had where they think, wow, we did what you said, and it's not. So there's some positive behavior support stuff going on. This information is really more for you guys to look at and to have as a resource. And more resource stuff. And some things to look for. So Any questions that we didn't cover or that you need clarification on?
What if you have a student that's not ESD that has behavioral problems?
Okay, are they under a 504 plan? Have they ever been evaluated?
They used to have an ESD for speech, but then they permanently switched to fine for the educational setting and they dropped it.
Hmm.
They told me that the psychologist would be the one to come in and do a behavior plan for him, but it wouldn't be the behavior specialist because those are only for ESD. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I've never heard that one before, but again, if the psychologist is trained to do that. But I would be concerned about whether there's an underlying disability. Because sometimes, and I've had students who were just identified for language, and then they get dismissed from language, and then we find them years later and figure out they had a learning disability. So I think it's something to look at, to just rule out. I would ask for an evaluation, and it all depends on what the behavior is. If you look at it and see, is the student struggling? Are they progressing academically? Is there an academic issue there? If they're not, what's the underlying function of that behavior?
Yeah, there's no academic issues. Just learning how to read people and behave in the setting.
Well, social emotional is still something that would be covered under IDEA if the student had specially designed instruction in that area. It is something to look for, requesting an evaluation in writing.
So what would be the name of the evaluation?
I would ask for a comprehensive evaluation. I would want to make sure that all areas are covered, and just because the student's making good grades, I've heard a lot of, well, he makes good grades, so we don't need to. I'd still want to rule it out just in case, because I found that sometimes teachers are very generous in grading. I've looked at one case I had where they kept saying there was no academic significance, impact on the student. And I looked at the students' work samples, and they were getting all A's. And if I had compared them to another student in the same grade, that was not A quality work. I kind of think that there was, I don't know if it was a little, I feel I need to help him and boost his self-esteem a little more, and I'm going to give him an A because he's such a good kid and he's trying so hard, but that wouldn't have been considered an A in another classroom. So grades are very subjective, and they're not the only underlying issue. I've had kids who get like all A's and B's and then tank on the standardized assessment test. And so we're like, well, is it the standardized assessment test that's not right for the student? Which, one size doesn't fit all. So yeah, I would still, if there's not a disability, and everyone doesn't have a disability just because you have a behavior, I'm not saying you do, but I would want to make sure that's addressed, because it's very frustrating, I'm sure for parents, because I know it is for me, is for me to get a 16-year-old who had a disability and it was not identified earlier.
And if they have an FBA, do they have a ESD or an FBA?
Well, if you do an FBA and you see that there's no behaviors that are impacting, you wouldn't need one. But if you do an FBA and there's behaviors identified, there should be a BIP. And it should be made for that student. Because again, I know a lot of school districts that say we have a school-wide behavior plan. And that may work for the majority of their students. But it's not working for the kid who keeps picking up referrals. So, thank you guys for coming at 5:30. There is a raffle at our booth. So, thank you. Stuck it out. You made it.